So my job in this first talk is to talk to you about the importance of temperature to fresh produce from a fresh produce perspective. So what is temperature? Temperature is the measure of hotness or coldness expressed in terms of any of several arbitrary scales, such as degrees centigrade, and indicating the direction in which heat energy will spontaneously flow. As you can see from the diagram down the bottom, heat diffuses from hotter area to the colder area, and cold doesn't diffuse. So it's all about heat movement. This slide here is about focusing in this talk on the biological aspects, so what's happening with the produce itself. So produce is self-heating. It's breathing, so it self-heats. It's like if we exert ourselves running, we get hot because we're burning up a lot of carbohydrate, which is shown on the left-hand side of that diagram up there, and it moves across through respiration to carbon dioxide and water as outputs, but we're releasing energy. So that's what we're dealing with the product itself. Down the bottom there with photosynthesis, that's what plants do. That's driving it in the other direction. And without plants, we wouldn't have life on Earth because they really build everything that we need. So does it really make a difference? Hang on, let me get that going. So, but we're talking about biology, and biology is the process of living things or the vital processes that occur, so life itself. It deals with all physico-chemical aspects of life. So it can be the mechanical structure of cells, or it can be the biochemistry within those cells. What we're looking at in this picture, in this little video here, is the movement of organelles in cells. The green organelles are the chloroplasts. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's some hyaline, really small organelles. They're the mitochondria. So the chloroplasts are what fixes carbon, and the mitochondria are what burns that carbon up in the process of respiration. So our fresh produce has all this stuff happening in it if you're keeping it under good conditions. If you're keeping it too hot or too cold, that process, that vital process of stirring the cells stops. Okay. So life itself is, in a physiological context, is any system containable of performing functions which include eating, metabolizing, excreting, breathing, moving, growing, reproducing, and responding to external stimuli. And certainly from a post-harvest horticulture perspective, metabolizing, breathing, growing, and responding to external stimuli are really important. And that's sort of demonstrated in this next slide. So what are we really considering when we're trying to manage produce post-harvest in relation to the temperatures under which we're holding the product? We're trying to manage development, maturation, and ripening. So respiration we've touched off on. Ethylene production, that drives the deterioration of fresh produce. It's produced by the product as well as being in the ambient atmosphere. Then we've got different types of products that behave in different ways. So climacteric produce is stuff that we can harvest green mature and ripen it after harvest. So tomato is a vegetable fruit. That's an example of that. And non-climacteric produce is produce that doesn't change dramatically in its metabolism, but it still changes and still senesces, and lettuce is a good example of that. The diagram on the right-hand side there, I've circled broccoli with red. So broccoli, we're all familiar with broccoli going yellow in the refrigerator or on the shelf, so not a good thing. That's senescence. Asparagus will actually turn, if you lie it flat, it'll turn up and try and grow towards space. That's gravitropism. So, and then onions will keep sprouting when you store them at too high a temperature and too high a humidity in your cupboard. So these are all processes that just illustrate the life of fresh produce. Mechanical injury is still important too, although that's a physical insult to product. The rate at which it browns is a function of temperature. So if you can keep the product cool, you may have still have a presentable product for people. Water loss, also a function of temperature. If you raise the temperature of air, its capacity to absorb water increases, so the vapor pressure deficit changes. and so you get increased transpiration. And then microbes are really important as well. So they usually like warm conditions. They usually like humid conditions. So pathogens are things like botrytis, which we get the grey mold you see on strawberries. But importantly, really importantly, are human pathogens. Some of the E. coli's that causes gastric upsets to people and can in fact cause death and wipe out whole businesses if they do so. So they're all affected by temperature. So what sort of magnitude of response do we get with temperature? One way we look at temperature is the Q10 effect, so the change in rate of processes for a 10-degree increment in temperature. So this is a little table from a book that's cited down the bottom. And just looking at 0, 10 and 20 degrees, which are temperatures which fresh produce frequently experience, we can look at the Q10. So we're looking at the Q10 between 10 and 0, and we see there's a threefold increase there. If we look at the Q10 between 20 and 10, we see there's a 2.5-fold increase. So what? So what does it actually mean? Moving to the far side of the diagram, looking at relative shelf life, if we set at 0 degrees C, the shelf life as being 100 units of shelf life. At 10 degrees C, we only have 33 units of shelf life. So we're losing 70% of our shelf life by going to 10 degrees C. If we go a further step to 20 degrees C, we lose another 10% of our shelf life. And looking at on the far side there, loss per day, it's basically 1% at 0 degrees C, 3% loss of shelf life at 10 degrees C, and 8% loss of shelf life at 20 degrees C. And of course, if you go higher, it gets horribly wrong, up to 25% loss per day at 40 degrees C. So looking at that graphically, it's more impactful, so you can see the fall off in relative shelf life as you move across the temperature stage from that graph. Not good. So not all vegetables are created equal, just like people. So we can look at the Q10 values and compare across different commodities. So here a range of, this is old data, 1942. This was published in a seminal paper in Plant Physiology. Snap beans for the lower range, 0.5 to 10 degrees C. We have a high Q10, so the five-fold change in the rate of metabolism over that small increment. By comparison, iceberg lettuce at the lower end of that scale, only 1.6-fold. So which one's the easiest product to handle and which one's the lesser sensitive to temperature? The iceberg lettuce is less sensitive to temperature. The snap beans are highly sensitive to, relatively speaking, highly sensitive to temperature. Of course, we just heard from Christian about we're moving through the supply chain, so we need to think in a time by temperature context. So this graph here, or this diagram here, just relates, let's see if this works. Down the bottom here, looking at product from cradle, which is harvest, through to grave. We've got the time dimension running along the bottom there, critically important in all factors. And then temperature, of course, we've just been talking about how important that is. And all product has a lower biological limit. Chilling sensitive product might chill at, say, 7.5 degrees centigrade. All product will freeze at just below 0 degrees centigrade. And then if we look at the upper temperature limit, we can get confused metabolism. So tomatoes that are ripened at too high a temperature will ripen to an orange colour, but they won't develop the red lycopene colour. So you get impairment of metabolic process there. These little squiggly lines are just scenarios, what goes off across there, what sort of can go on in terms of variation in the supply chain. But it's all about the supply chain and the value chain. Temperature is fundamental to quality. It's fundamental, tangibly fundamental to shelf life. It's critical for the value proposition for our customers. It's also critical for reputation and trust. So really, it's a good idea not to think so much about cold chains or supply chains, but think about value chains, because that's something that we're all involved in. Christian mentioned about sensors and also about, let me find that, Data wrangling, so which they do with their systems. So forensic was the example he used was the USB type loggers, where you can put them in and you can get the data at the end of the journey, and you can look back and see what went wrong with it. Real time, like the Escavox system, gives you that data in real time, and you have the opportunity of making interventions during the time that that product is travelling. We can also use the key elements of the data we record over time and temperature, and we can establish relationships between, in this case, remaining shelf life and the heat units that have accumulated during that journey. For some products, we get really good relationships like this one, and others we don't, but that's something we can fine-tune as we learn more and more about or improve our models. So with that, I'd like to wrap up that bit of my talk and just ask if there's any questions or comments at this point in time. If there's not, then I've got questions for you. So first one is, which vegetable has the higher respiration rate? Would it be broccoli or would it be Brussels sprouts? Someone wants?
Same.
Sorry?
Same, right?
Same.
No, not the same. So the one who said Brussels sprouts? Sorry, wrong. Broccoli have their inflorescences, they're rapidly metabolizing. They inherently have a higher rate of metabolism than Brussels sprouts, which are relatively mature leaf or leaf buds. So broccoli goes off the fastest. Which vegetable produces more ethylene, cucumber or tomato?
Tomato.
Tomato, yep, tomato, you're right. So tomato produces a lot more. It's a climacteric fruit type vegetable. So it goes through this ethylene climacteric and produces lots of ethylene. Actually, cucumber does the same thing, but we never eat ripe cucumbers. We only eat immature cucumbers, so to speak. And then last but not least, which vegetable has the greater Q10? Is it green beans or potato? Yeah, green beans, which we saw in that example. But also we can see there that you've got a rapidly metabolizing kind of immature pod compared to a relatively mature tuber in the case of potatoes. Okay, so with that I'll wrap up, and unless there's any burning question, we will move on. Thank you.